Yeah, that's fine. The Information Policy, Census, and National Archives Subcommittee will now come to order. Good afternoon and welcome to today's hearing entitled Census Data and Its Use in Federal Formula Funding. Today's hearing will examine the impact of using census data on local recipients in federal funding allocation decisions. On our first panel, we will hear from federal department witnesses who will testify about how select federal government agencies use census data in their funding formulas. Our second panel is comprised of local government officials and private agencies who will tell us about their knowledge and experience with census data and their recommendations to improve the use of census data in federal formula funding. Without objection, the chair and ranking minority member will have 5 minutes to make opening statements, followed by opening statements not to exceed 3 minutes by any other member who seeks recognition. Without objection, members and witnesses may have 5 legislative days to submit a written statement or extraneous materials for the record. And I'll begin with the opening statement. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine how census data is used in federal funding program calculations and whether these federal funding formulas fairly distribute federal monies to states, cities, and local governments. We will consider many important issues today, including what criteria are used in these federal funding formulas, whether Congress and agencies factor in the undercount of certain communities in these calculations, and what steps Congress and the administration can take to improve census data and the present formulas. Census data is used by over 180 federal programs in determining funding levels to cities, counties, and states. These federal allocations to local governments and states topped over $375 billion in 2007 alone. Federal programs that use census data in their funding formulas include Title I education appropriations, Medicaid, and community development block grants. This subcommittee is concerned about HUD's community development block grant program in particular, especially with regard to recent developments in Toledo, Ohio. In 2008, the mayor of Toledo challenged census estimates and successfully added over 20,000 city residents to Toledo's population. However, with this increase in population, Toledo lost over $290,000 in community development block grant funding. It is counterintuitive for HUD to provide Toledo with less federal funding because the Census Bureau increased the city's undercounted population numbers. Other federal funding formulas, such as Medicaid, redistribute hundreds of millions of dollars among states with census undercount data, when census undercount data is corrected. Federal funding formulas like Medicaid and community development block grants are sensitive to the undercount, which causes federal funds to be misallocated to cities and states, hurting traditionally undercounted populations such as low-income children and immigrant communities. Census data is used for a big majority of all federal funding formulas. There needs to be clarity and transparency as to how census data is used and if these federal funding formulas truly serve their targeted communities. Today's hearing will address these issues and reveal existing problems, solutions, and what further research needs to be done with census data and its use in federal funding formulas. Let me thank all of our witnesses for appearing today, and I look forward to their testimonies. I now yield to the distinguished ranking minority member, Mr. McHenry of North Carolina, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding today's hearing. And as the Chairman already stated, want to begin by thanking again Mr. Metzenborg and Mr. Goldenkopf for reappearing before the committee. It's good to have you back. And for the other witnesses, thank you so much for agreeing to testify and being here today. As the Chairman has already stated, the data collected by the Census Bureau is vitally important to the calculation of funding levels and appropriations in federal programs. At the congressional level and by federal agencies themselves. Data is also used by state and local governments to allocate resources and services, and by the private sector to determine where to invest in developed industry. The subject of today's hearing underscores the importance of filling out the decennial census form when it arrives on April 1st of 2010. It's vitally important that the American people and everyone in this country respond to that form. It's not a partisan issue. It's simply a matter of having an accurate picture of who is in this country on Census Day 2010. This is very important since it's a very core constitutional principle that we have an accurate count of who is here in this country, and with having a short form only census, it makes it even easier for the American people to participate. So, members of Congress should advocate for participation, and everyone within government should advocate for participation. And we're grateful for community groups being involved to ensure that people participate as well. I'd also like to thank the Chairman for having this hearing today. We last met in March, and I know that we've wrapped up address canvassing, as Mr. Metzenborg has relayed to the Congress, and from the accounts we've gotten, it's gone very well, and we're very grateful for that. And that address canvassing, as Mr. Metzenborg has previously said, is a cornerstone to the 2010 census, and I hope that we could have Mr. Metzenborg or the new director, whenever the Senate gets around to, well, being the Senate, I guess, whenever the Senate determines that they'll actually act, that we can actually get the new director in. But approximately 140,000 census workers took to America's streets this spring to verify addresses and assemble the Bureau's list of where decennial forms will be sent, and, if needed, enumerators will visit in 2010. On separate occasions, Chairman Clay and I have stated that we both have unanswered questions about this vast canvassing effort. The outcome of the decennial census depends largely on this step in the operation, and there's an obvious need to review and assess its successes and failures. And certainly the GAO and the Census Bureau would love to have you back. And, Mr. Chairman, I would certainly think we both learned a lot from that hearing. It's my hope that we can bring you back again soon to evaluate this step of the process. That said, today's hearing is an important opportunity for the committee to ensure that the census data and federal funding formulas are fair, accurate, and effective. Mr. Clay, Chairman Clay, I thank you for bringing this issue to the forefront about the inequities of community development block grant program. I do share your concerns. As for how census numbers affect the Cdbg, I'd like to point out that the funding formula involves many factors that in the 109th Congress, this subcommittee published in a bipartisan report dealing with that funding formula. I ask unanimous consent to submit this for the record.
Without objection, the document is submitted into the record.
And it's still regarded as a proper, strong roadmap of how to improve the Cdbg program by addressing the need as well as ensuring that we have proper numbers. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for having this hearing today. Appreciate your leadership, and thank you for your friendship.
Thank you so much, Mr. McHenry, and be assured that as soon as the new director is confirmed by the Senate, they will momentarily be before this committee. So, thank you. And I would like to recognize the gentlewoman from California for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for holding today's important hearing examining the role census data plays in the formulas used for distributing federal funds. And I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about the methodologies behind these formulas and the steps being taken to promote the census and to improve participation and to decrease the differential undercount to ensure that federal funds are appropriated to the areas in America where they are needed most. Since the establishment of the Decennial Census in 1790, every census has experienced an undercount. According to the Government Accountability Office, the 2000 census missed an estimated 2% of the U.S. population, a disproportionate number of which were minorities, low-income households, and children. And my district in particular has traditionally been undercounted due to a lack of mutual understanding and engagement with local constituencies. And this undercount is troubling because without accurate population data, it is impossible to ensure that we have a complete view of our nation's demographics and that Americans have proper representation in state and federal government and that federal grants are targeted to where they are needed most. According to the Census Bureau, for the fiscal year 2007, over $400 billion was allocated through federal grants and direct assistance programs based on formulas reliant on data from the 2000 census. And the amount of critical federal funding at stake reinforces the importance of an accurate and comprehensive 2010 census count for local, state, and tribal governments. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank today's panelists for their cooperation with our proceedings and for your leadership in ensuring that the 2010 census provides the most complete enumeration of our population in America history. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you so much. And I also want to recognize a visitor, a guest here, who will serve on the panel today, my good friend, Marcy Captor from Ohio. Thank you for coming today. And if you have any opening statements, you can be recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know that this mic is working, but I wanted to thank you very much for the opportunity to sit in. Our community of Toledo, Ohio, in the 9th District well know the importance of the census and the distribution of the tax dollars that our citizens send here to Washington and then by formula are sent back home. On the second panel, I'll have the pleasure of introducing our mayor and his team who've traveled very far, Mayor Carlton Finkbeiner. I'd like to recognize him now. 12-year mayor of our city, the first strong mayor in Toledo's history. And we're very proud of him and known as fought harder for accurate census counts than he has, having been someone who helped to do census when he was a youngster and saw what actually happened when people went out into the field. So we look forward to his testimony this afternoon, and I thank you very much for the time.
You're very welcome, and we look forward to your service on this committee today. And without further ado, we will I want to start by introducing our first panel. We will first hear from Mr. Thomas Messenborg, who is currently serving as the acting director of the U.S. Census Bureau. He has more than 36 years of Census Bureau experience and now oversees the day-to-day operations of the federal government's preeminent statistical agency. Next, we will hear from Mr. Robert Goldenkoff, a director on the U.S. Government Accountability Office's Strategic Issues team. He has over 20 years of program evaluation experience with GAO and is currently responsible for reviewing the 2010 Census and government-wide human capital reforms. Our third witness is Mr. Todd Richardson, the Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Policy Development for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. At HUD, he leads a team of staff responsible for analyzing current data and drawing on the results of past research to assist the Secretary with making informed policy decisions. Our next witness is Mr. Donald Modes, the newly appointed Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In this capacity, he provides leadership, direction, and management of policy research, analysis, evaluation, and coordination of department-wide science and data policy activities and issues. And our last witness on the first panel, Mr. Stewart Karachi is the acting commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics in the U.S. Department of Education. His career has been devoted to applying the best scientific methods to bringing information and evidence to bear on improving social programs. Let me thank all of you for appearing today before the subcommittee, and it is the policy of the committee to swear in all witnesses before they testify. I'd like to ask each witness to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Each of you will have 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Your complete written testimony will be included in the hearing. The yellow light in front of you will indicate that it is time to sum up, and the red light will indicate that your time has expired. When you hear this, that means shut it off. I am Mr. Messenborg. You may proceed with your opening statement.
Chairman Clay, Ranking Member McHenry, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the role that data produced by the Census Bureau plays in federal funds distribution. I appreciate the subcommittee's attention to this important issue, and I'm pleased to be testifying alongside for the agencies that use our data. This helps make an important distinction. The Census Bureau is not involved in developing, administering, or evaluating the funding formula or the programs that use our data. However, the Census Bureau, through the Decennial Census, the American Community Survey, and our Population Estimates program, is the producer of many of the data sources used by agencies in their funding formula. Our job is to produce the most accurate and complete data possible. Today, I will focus my testimony on how the Census Bureau produces the 3 major data sources used for funding formula. The Decennial Census program includes both the 2010 census and the detailed demographic, social, economic, and housing characteristics information produced by the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey collects data monthly for population and housing characteristics that previously were collected in the Decennial Census long form, and of course we publish that data annually. The Population Estimates program produces population estimates for the nation, for states, counties, cities, and towns on an annual basis. These population estimates update the most recent decennial census counts each year with new information using births, deaths, and net migration information. The population estimates are used in many formulas to allocate funding. They are also used in the production of the final American Community Survey estimates released to the public. Thus, the quality of the official population estimates and the American Community Survey are inextricably linked to the accuracy of the decennial census. Federal agencies that administer grants and other federal funds allocation programs typically use a mix of decennial census, population estimate, and information from the American Community Survey. I make this point to stress the importance of the upcoming 2010 census. Our government's division recently analyzed 140 federal grant and direct assistance programs for fiscal 2007 and concluded that over $400 billion are distributed annually using one or more of these Census Bureau data sources. There is no better way to emphasize the importance of the 2010 census for local, state, and tribal governments than by acknowledging this. In the years between the decennial censuses, the Population Estimates program of the Census Bureau produces the official population estimates for the United States. They are considered estimates because they are population figures that do not arise directly from a complete count. They are determined by using available data, for example, available administrative record data on births and deaths, as well as information from the IRS to track net migration flows. The estimates rely heavily on data from the latest available decennial census, as those census data serve as the basis on which the population estimates are constructed. Again, though, the most important contributing factor to a state's estimated population at any given point in time is the count of that state's population in the most recent decennial census. To ensure the population estimates are as accurate as possible, it is important and critical to have an accurate census count upon which the estimates can be built. To that end, we encourage everyone to participate in the 2010 census. In closing, I want to stress that the Census Bureau goal is to produce complete and accurate data that meet the needs of our customers. For federal funds allocation, the single most important contribution the Census Bureau can make is to count everyone, count them once, and count them where they usually reside. This is a daunting challenge, but we are committed to making the 2010 census the most successful ever. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Messenborg. Mr. Goldencoff.
Chairman Clay, Ranking Member McHenry, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss the role that population data plays in the allocation of federal funds to state and localities. In my written statement, we reported that in past years, the federal government has annually distributed over $300 billion in federal assistance through grant programs using formulas driven in whole or in part by census population counts. According to a new Census Bureau study, this figure is now over $400 billion for FY 2007. What's more, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act will obligate an estimated additional $161 billion to federal grant programs for fiscal year 2009, including some programs that depend, to some extent, on census population data to determine the amount of federal assistance. As agreed with the subcommittee, my testimony describes, 1, how census data are used in the allocation of federal formula grant funds, and 2, how the structure of the formulas and other factors can affect those allocations. In particular, I want to stress 2 key points. First, although population counts play an important role in the distribution of federal funds, other factors, such as the design of the grant formulas, can mitigate the effect that any population changes have on funding levels. And second, because population estimates are important for federal funding allocations, and the decennial census is the foundation for these estimates, an accurate enumeration in 2010, including the reduction in the historic undercount of minority and other populations, as well as a complete count of communities affected by Hurricane Katrina and other natural disasters, is absolutely essential. Federal grants use various sources of population data in their funding formulas. The largest of these is the decennial census, which the Census Bureau conducts every 10 years. The Bureau also estimates the population for the years between censuses, known as post-censal estimates. For example, the allocation formula for social services block grants, which helps states fund daycare, health, substance abuse, and numerous other programs, uses the most recent post-censal population estimates to distribute funds. Another source of population data is the Bureau's American Community Survey, which provides detailed annual data on socioeconomic characteristics for the nation's communities. It's used to allocate federal funds for such programs as the Section 8 Housing Voucher Program, which is aimed at increasing affordable housing choices for very low-income households. A third source is the Current Population Survey, which is conducted by the Census Bureau for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. CPS data are used to allocate funds for programs under the Workforce Investment Act of 1998, which provides workforce development services to employers and workers. Among funding formulas that rely on population data, that degree of reliance varies. On the one hand, the Social Services Block Grant formula allocates funding based on states' population relative to the total U.S. population. On the other hand, some formulas, such as Medicaid, use population plus one or more other variables to determine funding levels. As the completeness and accuracy of population data can modestly affect grant funding streams and other applications of census data, the Bureau has used a variety of programs to address possible errors in population counts and estimates. Importantly, however, while accurate population data play an important role in allocating federal assistance, various grant-specific factors can also affect the distribution of federal funds and can mitigate the impact of population changes. For example, some grant programs, including Medicaid, employ floors in order to mitigate the outcome that would result if a particular grant allocation were determined by the funding formula alone. Further, in order to prevent funding losses from a formula change, programs can include hold harmless provisions guaranteeing a level of funding that is based on a prior year's funding. In conclusion, while population data play an important role in allocating federal assistance through grant programs, the design of a grant can also affect funding allocations and in some cases can mitigate or entirely mute the impact of a change in population. Further, shifts in population, inaccuracies in census counts, and methodological problems with population estimates also impact the distribution of federal grant money. Nevertheless, given the importance of census data as a baseline for post-census estimates used for grant programs, as well as for congressional apportionment and redistricting, counting the nation's population once, only once, and in the right location in 2010 will be absolutely critical. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my remarks, and I will be glad to answer any questions that you or other subcommittee members may have.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Mr. Goldenkoff. Mr. Richardson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Clay, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. HUD annually allocates directly or through guided competitions more than $10 billion to cities, counties, states, Indian tribes, and other grantees using several different formulas based on census data. The Community Development Block Grant Program, proposed for fiscal year 2010 to allocate nearly $4.2 billion, allocates the largest share of the dollars. Cdbg is a relatively complicated dual formula, with one formula allocating towards communities that have growth and higher poverty, and another formula allocating to communities that generally have old housing and population lost. These formulas rely on 5 variables from the Census Bureau. From Census 2000 data, persons in poverty, overcrowded households, and housing units built prior to 1940. These variables are fixed until we integrate American Community Survey in fiscal year 2011. From annual population estimate data, including updated data as a result of challenges, number of persons, and a variable called growth lag. And I'm going to talk a little bit about growth lag because it affects the question that you raised about Toledo. The growth lag variable is used to fund communities that have had historically declining populations. And if a community that has historically declining populations does a population challenge that shows that its population is actually larger than we had thought it was, the net result on the Cdbg formula, unlike most formulas, is to result in a funding change that would reduce funding under the Cdbg program. So that's a little unusual in terms of how formulas operate, but that's been in place since 1977 when the formula was put in place.
I'll ask you to explain it in more detail when we get to the questioning period, but go ahead.
Absolutely. Other programs that allocate funding using the basic Cdbg formula are the Emergency Shelter Grant Program and the Guiding Initial Pro Rata Need Allocation for the Continuum of Care Homeless Program competition. Separate formulas relying on census data, largely sample data from the Census 2000, include the Home, Native American Housing Block Grant, Indian Cdbg, Section 202, and Section 811 programs. The Housing Trust Fund, created in HERA and proposed by the President to receive $1 billion for fiscal year 2010, would also be allocated to states using special tabulation data on housing needs. In 2010, as you know, the Census Bureau plans to publish the first 5-year data products based on American Community Survey data collected in 2005 through 2009. Beginning in fiscal year 2011, HUD plans to use ACS 5-year average data in place of the Census 2000 sample data that are used to allocate most of the funding for the programs I just described. Our understanding is that the 5-year ACS data will be weighted to the average of the population controls over the 5-year period. This is a very good thing since it leads to an integration of updated population and updated counts for all of the variables for each formula on an annual basis. That said, the initial move to the ACS data in fiscal year 2011 is very likely to cause some significant changes in allocation amounts for program grantees. Quality of data is only half of the equation in allocation formulas. Quality of the formula is equally important. Because housing and community development needs are not static, it is important to regularly assess whether these formulas need updating so they remain well targeted to the intended needs and treat all grantees fairly. In 2005, HUD published a report that identified some problems with how the Cdbg formula targets funds. The 2005 report demonstrates some stark examples of how the Cdbg formula is currently not as fair as it could be. It overfunds some less needy places, it underfunds some very needy places, and it allocates very different grant amounts to places with similar needs. The current formula, on average, will target more funds to the most needy communities, but does so much less so than it did when it was developed in the 1970s. There are several problems with the current formula, including the use of housing built before 1940 as a proxy for population loss, aging infrastructure, and dilapidated housing. While this may have worked in the 1970s, since the 1970s, the more distressed communities have torn down that old housing while the less distressed communities have retained it, leading to a shift in dollars from distressed communities to less distressed communities. Other variables like poverty are good measures, but they create some anomalies, such as college towns getting large grants because of the large number of students that are counted in poverty, and the growth lag variable, which generally targets places with losing population, but there are some well-off communities that have been static in population since 1960 that get significant grants as well. The other problem is that this is a dual formula, and a dual formula creates some anomalies in itself, funding similarly needed communities at very different amounts. As you are well aware, changing the Cdbg formula to correct its targeting problem is politically challenging. If funding is held static or declining, a change in the formula that results in increases in funding for some communities also results in decreases for others. Fiscal year 2010, however, offers a rare opportunity to change the Cdbg formula without causing a funding decrease for any community relative to the fiscal year 2009 allocations. This is because for fiscal year 2010, President Obama has proposed to fully fund Cdbg at $543 million more than the amount funded in 2009. This gives us an opportunity to implement a hold harmless provision. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Clay, Ranking Member McHenry, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the topic of how data from the United States Census Bureau are used by the Department of Health and Human Services in the allocation of federal program funds through formula grants. HHS is the United States government's principal agency for protecting the health of all Americans and providing essential human services, especially for those who are least able to help themselves. We administer more than 300 programs covering a wide spectrum of activities and representing almost a quarter of all federal outlays. HHS administers more grant dollars than all other federal agencies combined and awards approximately 60% of the federal government's grant dollars. In fiscal year 2008, HHS awarded nearly $265 billion in grants, representing 38% of total departmental spending. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services awarded the largest amount of grant dollars, and the National Institutes of Health awarded the largest number of grants. For most of the formula grants administered by HHS, the grant allocation formula and data elements are specified in statute. Attached to my written statement is a table listing the HHS-sponsored grants that specify the use of data from the Census Bureau in allocating grant funds. I'd like to highlight a few examples of how HHS uses specific census data elements in grant programs. They are representative of a variety of grant programs administered by HHS, as well as the types of census data that are used in calculating grant award amounts in carrying out statutory intent. The first is the Child Care and Development Fund, which is the primary federal program specifically devoted to providing families access to child care and improving the quality of child care. Grants are awarded to states through 3 component funding streams, 2 of which rely on the use of Census Bureau data in their funding formula. One allocates block grant funding to states using a formula that includes the state's share of the nation's children under 5. The other awards funding to eligible states based on their share of the nation's children under age 13. Data for both children's ratios are obtained from the Census Bureau. The Congregate Nutrition Services and Home Delivered Nutrition Services programs provide meals and related nutritional services to older individuals who help them remain independent and in their communities. Grants for Congregate Nutrition Services and Home Delivered Nutrition Services are allocated to states and territories by a formula based on their share of the population age 60 and over, using data issued by the Census Bureau. The mission of the Maternal and Child Health Block Grant is to improve the health of mothers, children, and their families by improving access to health care, eliminating health disparities, and improving the quality of health care. Funding for one component of this program is allocated to states in proportion to their population of low-income children relative to the nation's. The formula uses census data. The majority of HHS's grant allocations, however, are not driven by Census Bureau data. For example, over 3/4 of mandatory grant funds awarded by HHS are received by states through the Medicaid program. Census data are used by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, but not by HHS, to produce state and national per capita income data, which then are used in calculating the federal medical assistance percentage known as FMAP. State spending on covered Medicaid services is matched by the federal government at the FMAP rate. The authorizing statutes that specify funding allocation formula for HHS grant programs typically specify the use of either the decennial population figures or the most recent population estimates from the current population survey published by the Census Bureau. The statutory formula do not direct the department to use the census data that have been adjusted for population undercount, and HHS does not make any adjustments of its own. In summary, HHS uses a variety of data from the Census Bureau in calculating funding levels for federal grant programs. Of the 300 programs administered and managed by the Department of Health and Human Services, 50 are grant programs, and of them, census data are used to calculate funding levels in 35. Census data are used by HHS in all cases where authorizing legislation dictates its use and the manner in which it is to be used. HHS does not exercise any discretion to adjust funding formula. Thanks for the opportunity to testify. Be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, for your testimony. Mr. Karachi, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Clay, Ranking Member McHenry. Equipment problem. And distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the topic of the use of Census Bureau data in the allocation of federal formula funding of the Department of Education's programs. Since the mid-1960s, the National Center for Education Statistics has computed or provided data to other entities within the department to compute federal funding allocations for various department formula grant programs. We prepare the allocation tabulations in a statistically accurate and apolitical manner. Most allocations for the department's elementary and secondary education programs are based on the latest data for some relevant subset of the population. In 2009, of more than $50 billion that the Department of Education is spending on elementary and secondary education, approximately 80% is being allocated based on census calculations of population subgroups. Let me provide examples. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, Title I grants to local education agencies, is the single largest federal elementary and secondary education program. For fiscal year 2009, Congress provided $24.5 billion for this program. From its inception, Title I's formula has been based primarily on the number of children ages 5 through 17 in families with incomes below the poverty level. In the spring of each year, NCES renews its interagency agreement with the Small Area Income and Poverty Estimates branch of the Census Bureau to develop and to deliver to the department school district level Title I poverty and population estimates. These estimates cover most of the nation's public school districts. Before publication, Census provides the estimates to state agencies and gives states an opportunity to review the estimates and challenge them. This so-called challenge period allows states to present information regarding boundary changes that may need to be updated in the Census Bureau's geographic database. Second, since the mid-1970s, NCES provides assistance for calculation of career and technical education allocations under the Perkins Act. The population groups used in the formula have remained consistent throughout the years, ages 15 to 19, 20 to 24, and 25 to 65, from the census's annual state population estimates. States' allocations are based on their shares of the count for each of the three age groups, multiplied by a factor based on per capita income, which we currently obtain from the Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis. Next, the eligible groups for adult education state grants has traditionally consisted of those who are age 16 and over, do not have a high school diploma or equivalent, and are not currently enrolled in school. Until 2006, these data were available only from the decennial census. The Census Bureau will now collect these data using the American Community Survey, the ACS. Finally, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is the law authorizing funding for services to individuals with disabilities throughout the nation. Under Part B, Section 619, services must be provided to children with disabilities between the ages of 3 through 5, and under Part B, Section 611, services must be provided to children with disabilities between 6 and 21. Each of these formulas requires annual population and poverty data of 3 through 21-year-olds. These come from the Census Bureau's annual population estimates and the ACS, respectively. By statute, the Department accepts Census Bureau's data and does not question the incidence of over or undercounts. We understand that to the extent feasible, the Census Bureau adjusts post-census annual population estimates, small area estimates, and ACS data for known shortcomings in the prior decennial census. It is also our understanding that the annual estimates used in our formula grant allocations are informed by recent demographic changes that might affect the distribution of funds. In summary, these examples cited illustrate how the Department of Education uses the array of Census Bureau tabulations to distribute our formula grant funds. We have a history of more than 30 years cooperating with the Census Bureau to provide the data needed for the U.S. Department of Education grants. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Very much, Mr. Karachi. And thank you all. Thanks to all of the witnesses for your testimony today. We will begin the Q&A period now. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of the panel. I will begin. This first question is a panel-wide question. I guess it would have to be these last three to answer, and Mr. Goldencoff may have to answer too. Do your formulas account for the undercount that always occurs in certain communities? Or should they account for that? And if they should or shouldn't, tell me why. Mr. Richardson, we can begin with you.
Sure. The sample data that's used in most of our formulas is the published sample data. So most of our variables for our formula are based on the census sample data, and to the extent those are adjusted, and generally they aren't, our formulas are driven by those. With the exception in the Cdbg formula of the population variable and growth lag variable, which are indeed changed each year to reflect the published population estimates from the, and if those are challenged estimates, we include those.
And we're statutorily required to follow to use the most recent census data. In the vast majority of cases, there are no instances where we adjust, and it's our view that statute requires us to do that.
We are similarly statutorily required to use the census data, but in addition, we wouldn't have a firm basis to adjust the data on our own. Where we have the statutory authority to do so. We're only able to use what's presented to us by the Census Bureau as the best available data.
On that point, do the Thank you. On that point, and we'll start with you. Do the yearly census estimates adequately adjust formula funding to make up for the discrepancies that result from the undercount?
I really can't answer that. Where we're allowed to use those data, and we do in some instances, our statisticians just simply don't have the basis to make that interpretation.
Well, but when Census sends you new data, I mean, don't you adjust for that?
Yes. We have formulas that allow us to use the post-census data, and we do use them in those instances, yes.
Right. How about you, Mr. Moe?
And again, we don't use any adjusted data. We just use census data. So, and we similarly wouldn't be in a position to comment on the accuracy of that data because we're not in the business of counting people. That would be a question that's probably better suited for
but when data is adjusted, when data is corrected, don't you all have an interest in getting it correct too?
Clearly, we have an interest in having population figures that are as accurate as possible. But again, we're not statutorily allowed to
do the right thing by adjusting the data, correct?
It's our view that the law tells us that we're required to use that. If there were to be changes in how that data would be collected, those would have to be statutory changes that would be done by
on an annual basis.
Yeah, we do use as the annual adjusted data that comes through that's produced by the census. We do use. Sorry for the confusion. Yeah,
Mr. Richardson.
Well, as I noted, we do use the data that's adjusted for population and growth lag in the Cdbg formula. And with the American Community Survey, which we will be rolling into our formulas starting in fiscal year 2011, to the extent that Census updates those numbers to reflect the current population estimates and any challenges that are brought against those population estimates, we would include those in our formulas going forward as we use the American Community Survey.
Okay, and then how do we make up for the funding discrepancies once you get new data? Do you adjust what your formulas for the new data and new population, like in the case of Toledo? I mean, I heard your explanation about.
So Toledo, and actually the Cdbg formula is an unusual formula in that it's one of the few formulas that if you have a declining population, you actually get more money for having fewer people, which is an unusual formula in that way. And that was the case with Toledo, which successfully challenged its population estimates. By successfully challenging its population estimates, we rolled in that challenge. And because Toledo was receiving money because of how many people it had relative to 1960, when that number increased, it led to a smaller Cdbg grant. Because the Cdbg funds are intended to serve communities in decline, communities that have lost a lot of population get substantially more than communities that have gained population.
That Cdbg formula can be changed here in Congress or by the agency?
It's in statute, and it has to be changed by Congress. The President Obama's fiscal year 2010 budget proposal is proposing that formula actually be updated and be changed, and we're looking forward to working with the Congress on that.
Mr. Goldenkoff, did you have anything?
Yeah, I think, to the extent that these formulas compensate for the undercount, it all depends on the approach used to correct the data. As Mr. Messenberg said, the census data are updated throughout the decade, but those updates are largely the result of administrative records. So the extent to which those administrative records capture those people who tend to be historically updated, historically undercounted rather, then the better quality data. But that's an open question on how good those administrative records are. I think it's important to keep in mind that no census has ever been actually adjusted using statistical means to compensate for the differential undercount or any undercount. And so, as we've been saying, the accuracy of all these post-census estimates really starts with the quality of the decennial census. And so to the extent that there has always been an undercount, that undercount has never been adjusted, then that affects the data going forward.
Thank you for that response. Mr. McHenry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. Mr. Metzenborg, although the focus of this hearing is obviously with the American Community Survey and the data put out and the funding formulas and that, in that regard, we haven't had you back since address canvassing was finished. And our staffs have been briefed from your folks at the Bureau, and we thank you for that. I know that you had a pretty strong assessment of how well it was, but I know the GAO had a less rosy assessment. But if you could touch on how successful you viewed the address canvassing.
Certainly. We view it as a very successful undertaking. As you recall, a year ago, there was much angst about our ability to make the handheld computers work. Mm-hmm. We did a lot of testing in December and prior to the address canvassing. And we actually started in 8 of the local census offices a week early. We also, rather than doing it in 2 waves as originally planned, waves of about 5 weeks each, we split that into 5 different waves, and we started it in most of the local census offices at the same time. Mm-hmm. The result of that is we were pretty well 99% done with as nearly a month ahead of schedule. The areas that we had to wrap up had to do with areas that had flooding, like the Red River. And we had mudslides in Puerto Rico. We had a tornado in Kentucky. In fact, our finish date is July 17th. We have 3 assignment areas that we're completing right now. They're in Jackson, Mississippi, which face flooding. And we will complete those. In fact, we are helicoptering canvassers into that area, because once they can get into the area, they can actually walk the streets, and they will finish that operation this week. So I see it as a very successful operation. We are doing lessons learned as a result of that. We had great success recruiting. The goal was to recruit about 700,000 folks to fill 140,000 jobs, and we had 1.2 million applicants for those 140,000 jobs. So we probably had the most highly skilled workforce that we've had on the decennial census, and that was huge for us.
What are you on budget?
Right now, we've run about 15% over budget, and a good amount of that, we're doing a detailed analysis, as you would expect right now. We went into the address operation with an assumption that we would have 10% of the addresses would be deletes, that we would go to there and we'd actually remove them from the list. We don't have the final number on that, but it's more like almost double, a little less than double of that. What that means is we're going to err in the direction of keeping an address on the address list rather than removing it. So if we have an address that we believe is delete, we're going to send an additional person out to verify that. That requires more mileage, more effort, more enumerator time. So we expect that most of that will be associated with the underestimation of the deletes.
We've had a lot of discussion about the handheld computers. Do you believe they worked?
Yeah, I believe they worked effectively. I mean, we had some glitches during the first startup operation. Most of those were associated with getting enumerators in touch with the help desk. But originally, we were assuming something like about 30%, a 30% volume for help desk, and that turned out to be much less than that. So we had about a week of shakiness there, but the handhelds performed well.
Absolutely. Mr. Goldenkoff, what's the GAO's initial survey of how well address canvassing went?
I think it's too early at this point to make any blanket statements about the overall success of address canvassing. So I think you need to parse it out into different components. As you know, there was a lot of concern over the handheld devices, and as Mr. Messenberg said, there were some initial glitches, but the Census Bureau did an excellent job in overcoming those with workarounds. We were out in the field in about 30 different locations. I myself was out in Meridian, Mississippi, and also New Orleans, so I saw some of this myself. The handhelds really were very effective in helping the address canvassers figure out where they are, not to go over boundaries or into other areas. So that was a positive story. They also finished largely ahead of schedule, which was good news. One of the things that we're looking at there, though, was quality sacrifice at the cost of speed, and so we're looking into that. So in terms of some other things, though, that perhaps could have gone better, Mr. Messenberg said they are over budget. Fingerprinting, as you know, that was an issue, something that we've been looking at pretty closely. And about 23% of the fingerprint cards were unreadable, and my understanding is that those individuals whose cards could not be read or scanned by the FBI, so they had an initial applicant name check, but they did not have their fingerprints reviewed by the FBI, were still allowed to work. And so there's a security issue in that, of course, and there's also cost, too, because basically the money that was spent on those fingerprints and having them reviewed by the FBI just went to waste. There were some transmission issues with the cell phone service in rural areas. Not a major issue, but it did affect some of the efficiency of the address canvassers. Recruiting went well. Had a very good quality workforce, very conscientious. I think all of the GAO folks that were in the field were very impressed with how hard and how conscientious the temporary workers did their jobs. So at this point, as I said, it's just too early to take a comprehensive or make any comprehensive or overarching statements. But we'll be looking at each of those different components as we move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McHenry. Mrs. Capter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and I really appreciate being able to participate today. And thank you for your leadership. Mr. Messenberg, I wanted to ask you, the Census Bureau is aware of such communities as Toledo, Ohio, which have suffered undercounting of its population in previous years. We've seen what's happened in the New Orleans region. And one of my concerns is the rising extraordinary level of housing foreclosures. What is the Census Bureau in these foreclosures in regions like Toledo, obviously the New Orleans area, and others? What is the Census Bureau doing to offer additional financial support or assistance, training personnel that could help these types of communities that have been so damaged by the economy or natural circumstances to achieve a proper count of their population, because it isn't clear that these individuals who are being foreclosed on are leaving their communities?
Okay, I'd be glad to talk about that. Perhaps I should just take a second to talk about the Population Estimates Program and the Challenge Program. As we described before, at the national, the state, and the county level, basically we're starting with the Census 2000 count. And then we're adding in births, subtracting deaths for that location, and then doing an adjustment for migration, both international, so someone that immigrated into the U.S. from Europe or wherever, and we use the American Community Survey to do that. We also look at migration within states and within counties, across counties, and we use the IRS data typically to do that. That's what we call the ADREC data, and we believe that methodology is performing very well. At the sub-county level, at the sub-county level, for example, for Toledo, what we would use is the housing unit method. So we would start with the estimate of the number of housing units in Toledo in 2000, And then we take what the occupancy rate was in 2000 and what the persons per household were in 2000, and we also have an adjustment for group quarters. Right now, the POP estimate program for this sub-county level data is using the Census 2000 average person per household and the Census 2000 occupancy rate. So I can give you an example for Flint, Michigan of what the impact is of this methodology. So our 2008 POP estimate for Flint, Michigan is 112,900 individuals. If we use the challenge method, and the challenge method, people come in and tell us they have additional housing units. And when they do that, we use the Census 2000 per person, average per person household, and we use the occupancy rate. So, for example, in Flint, the occupancy rate in Census 2000 was 81.9%. From our most recent American Community Survey, which is the 3-year estimate spanning 2005 through 7, the occupancy rate is 78.5%. By using the existing challenge method, which used Census 2000, we would have estimated a population growth in Flint of 9.3%. If we actually updated that per person, per household, and the occupancy rate using the most current data, Flint would have had a reduction of 6.4%. So what I want to clarify is the challenge process, we invite any locality to challenge, and typically of the 39,000 jurisdictions that we publish data, typically about 100 ask for a challenge proposal package, and about 64 actually challenge. When they challenge, if they can come in and demonstrate to us that they have additional housing units, then we will go back and use the Census 2000 persons per household and the Census 2000 occupancy rate. Given, as you're talking about, Congresswoman, the decline in occupancy rate, that the challenge biases the population estimates up. So if we flash forward a year or two, we probably do not want to be using the 2010 average person per household or the 2010 occupancy rate. So this is one of the things that we have on our research agenda, to look at the housing unit estimate component, which is sub-county, and to also take another look at the challenge process itself. Now, what are we doing to improve the count? We're going to spend over $300 million on paid advertising, with a huge increase in the advertising that goes into the local areas. Probably the biggest single thing we're going to do is we're going to have nearly 2,900 partnership specialists working in our local offices, and we'll have nearly 500 local census offices scattered across the U.S. In Census 2000, we had about 600 people reaching out to local organizations. This time it's more like 2,900. So they are the folks, they are the trusted voices that we want to be in Toledo to convince the mayor, to convince others, form a complete count committee. We'll work with you to improve that count. So in brief, that's what we're doing.
I guess my only comment, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure my time has expired, but in a community like Toledo, over 12% of our housing stock is now foreclosed, and the rate is rising. I was in a neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, now declared the poorest city in America, over the weekend, and we were in Slavic Village, a neighborhood where they claim 75% of the homes have been foreclosed. And I just wonder, when you go door to door, when you send out material, you know, how you really find the people that used to live in those homes.
Okay, so what we've done through the address canvassing is identify all the addresses. So if it exists, it's on the address list. We did not attempt to make a determination whether it was occupied or vacant, because obviously that could change by April of 2010. We think we've done a good job in terms of identifying the addresses. What we are doing is taking a look at our procedures for the non-response follow-up, because you're 100% correct. If that's a vacant housing unit and we mail out a census form, we are not going to get a census form mailed back. So starting May 1st in 2010, we're going to send an enumerator out to knock on that door. In some cases, it's obvious that that's a vacant housing unit. In other cases, it's not so obvious. In some cases, maybe someone else is living there or multiple families are living there. We know that's going to be a challenge, but that's got to be part of our communication message to get trusted voices in the people. If someone is doubling up in a housing unit, to actually report that accurately. If they don't, we will miss people.
And just on that point, Ms. Capter, I would hope that the Bureau's research would bring to light that there may need to be different methodologies in this era of housing foreclosures post-Katrina. I mean, I was down in New Orleans for the address canvassing, and believe you me, the enumerators do not have an easy task. They have to go up to buildings that may look vacant, but there is electric wires going into the building. So perhaps there's someone living there, and they have to keep coming back day after day to figure it out. So their task is not easy either, and hopefully the research will bring us new methodology.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We know that we'll have between 10 and 20 million people in this country whose homes will be foreclosed by next year. That is a shocking figure, and we haven't.
That the people are somewhere, though.
Somewhere.
Let me go to our colleague from Georgia, Mr. Westmoreland. Recognize him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Messenberg, just to clarify that, you can't do the 2010 census based on where people are living in 2009, correct?
That's correct.
You have to wait till you send the forms out in 2010.
That's correct. The address canvassing has been to build as complete a list of housing unit addresses as we can, and then that's the vehicle to help us deliver report forms.
And that's being done with the handheld computers,
That was
correct?
done with the handheld computers.
And in prior testimony that you've testified in front of this committee, a lot of the data that you get does come from local city and county governments. Is that correct, as far as housing starts or permits, births, deaths?
Well, the construction information will come from the local government permit office. Information on births and deaths come from the vital record agencies, not from the local government.
But you do get some information from local government.
Oh, certainly. In terms of the updates to our construction program, new construction activity, so any construction that's occurred since we finished address canvassing near the end of June, and before we do the census, we will be getting building permits flowed to us from local governments, and we'll have an opportunity to send an enumerator out to actually collect information from those new units. That will happen in late July and August of 2010.
Mr. Messenberg, you say you've been at the Census Bureau for 36 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So
Maybe it's almost 37 now.
So this is not your first rodeo
No.
when it comes to the census. Would you say that the process of doing the census has gotten better over the years?
Well, I think it's become more challenging. If we look at just the diversity in terms of additional languages, the recent economic problems that the nation has faced, I think it's clear this is going to be one of our most challenging censuses. We feel we have the procedures in place to conduct a successful census, but we believe our partnership program especially is key to deliver that message, to mobilize the communities. And I mean, I think we've all been very impressed by the energy of the different constituencies and how committed they all are to make this a successful census. So I think having nearly 2,900 partnership specialists in the field is going to be key for us to connect with local areas. And of course, we'll hire locally also.
Sure.
That's a key strategy.
When just to go back over a little bit of your population estimates program, it's my understanding that you start off with the decennial number, or the census.
The census count, right?
And then you add births, subtract deaths. Is that true?
That's true.
And then I guess for the internal migration, let's say somebody moves from Patrick's district to a good congressional district in Georgia. What kind of data would you use to track that?
Okay, so for the population that's under 65, we use the IRS tax data to do that from year-to-year movement. That has about 80% coverage of the population. For the population 65 or older, we use the Medicare information, and we use that address information on that.
Okay, so that's kind of your formula for coming up with that. Now, how about the American Community Survey? Can you kind of explain to that how you use that?
Well, the American Community Survey is the replacement for the old long form. So in 1990, 2000, and previous censuses, 1 in 6 households got a long form, and it was long. It's over 50 pages, but that's the source of all the social, economic, and household information. So we've replaced that once in a decade long form survey with the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey samples about 250,000 households a month and then publishes data annually. So in September, probably September 22nd, we will produce the 2008 estimates for all jurisdictions with 65,000 or more population. And then in December, we will produce the 3-year estimate, which will be 6, 7, and 8, for all jurisdictions with over 20,000 population. Next December will be the first time we produce the 5-year estimates, and those will go down to the very smallest geographic area. So it is really the primary source of the social-economic data, poverty statistics, income, information on disability, and so on.
One final question, if I could, Mr. Chairman. I know that this population estimates that you've had, at least from the numbers I've seen, that over the past 3 decades, you've been really